Remember old point-and-click adventure games? Whatever happened to that kind of style of game? I remember when they first showed up. Well, I remember when I first played them, going from what came before to the point-and-clicks. Point-and-clicks freed us from the confines of the text terminal, but at the same time, they shackled us to the user interface. They shackled us to what you could actively click on, adding more development time so that you couldn't try to eat your own inventory anymore, or try to hug everything in sight. A text parser gave you more freedom than a point-and-click adventure game ever could. Of course, if the developer decided to give you that freedom. If the developer decided to add responses to whatever actions you thought that would be funny to do in the game. When you went to point and click, you had a limited vocabulary, and as we dropped the interface that actually showed you the verbs you could use, and we relied on icons and then on just left and right clicking for interact and examine, we lost even more. And yet it can't be understated how important the point and click was at streamlining the interface, at making things easy, accessible, at making King's Quest 3 less panicky. Have you played King's Quest 3? I suggest you try and play it. It's a game that's against the clock, where you're the prisoner of some wizard that's got you doing chores on a certain schedule. And if you don't adhere to the schedule that the wizard gave you, you're dead. It's a game that will force you to learn how to type fast and accurately. You can't take time to spell check everything to make sure it's well written. It can be a nerve-wracking game. In its original version, the enhanced version that got the SVGA version, I believe, did implement a user interface with mouse controls and, it did make the beginning part of the game easier, but if I'm not mistaken, that was the game with the Yeti pie puzzle, which in itself is also one of the hallmarks of maybe why the point and click as we knew it sort of went away a bit. But I'm not going to get into puzzles too much because I think I made a show about it last year or 2 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. Gotta be honest, did not really prepare all that much for this show because CES is going on right now and I cover the event in my day job and I have to keep doing that until the end of the week, basically. But that's besides the point. There was a shift, a noticeable, absolute shift in adventure games. In point-and-click adventure games, to be more precise. There was a time when they were dead. Everybody you would ask would say that adventure games are dead. And to be fair, they were kind of out. No big studio was making them. Well, to be fair, no big truly big studio is making them. It's a genre that peaked in its initial form and then sort of became part of the background. A little tiny part, insignificant, but still with its own niche. And that niche continued to actually make games. But they tended to not be made by the same people or the same companies that used to make them in the old days. Instead, these adventure games were created by small studios from Europe, from South America even. They were trying to keep the same kind of point-and-click adventure style with their own sort of flavor. You had games like the Black Mirror series, you had Scratches, you of course had the Siberia series, the Still Life series, you had a bunch of them. But they weren't what you would call mainstream, not until a company that had ties to the old adventure game series on account of Dave Grossman working there, and Dave Grossman being one of the people that worked at LucasArts when they made some of the best adventure games in history. It wasn't until Telltale Games tried to make their own version of Sam & Max. This wasn't their first game. They previously tried to make a series of adventure games based on Bone, which, gotta be honest, I had not actually heard of Bone up until I played the adventure game. They also made like a bajillion CSI games, but that's a whole other matter. It was Sam & Max who sort of brought adventure back into the mainstream, back into the attention of everybody. It was Sam & Max that said to people, hey, remember this? And people went, yeah, we kinda do. But it was not really the same Sam & Max. And not just because it had different voice actors, which I gotta say, I actually like better than the original ones. I don't know, maybe it's just these were fresher. They sort of fit better, is what I'm feeling. Well, they were different because they were episodic. They were compact. They threw away some of the baggage usually associated with adventure games, and that being the idea that if you're gonna pick up that wrench on the third screen at about 15 minutes of the game, yet the one you need after 3 hours of gameplay, you can't win, you can't finish, you can't progress. To be fair, a lot of video games sort of fixed that. I mean, some like the Runaway series wouldn't even let you pick up something unless you actually needed it. That was kind of a bad thing because you keep having to go back and pick up things and see if you can actually pick them up, I mean. But making the game episodic limited the amount of stuff you could do with puzzles. You couldn't have a puzzle take the player 5 hours anymore. You had to tone them down. You had to make them more manageable. And to be fair, Sam & Max still had some interesting puzzles when it first came out, like the first season. And that sort of started to decline a bit with the second one, and then the third one. I've still got hopes for a fourth one on the way one day. And then they brought out Back to the Future, the game, which had really simple puzzles. I mean, puzzles with basically pretty much nothing to them. The solution would often be evident the moment you saw the situation. It wasn't really much of a puzzle anymore. It still had some elements where you would have to think things through, but it was a foreshadowing of what was to come. With The Walking Dead, there are no puzzles in The Walking Dead. It's a point-and-click adventure game with no puzzles. You are basically in a choose-your-own-adventure kind of style of game where your choices, while they do impact small things, they don't actually matter that much in the long run. But again, there are no puzzles in there. It's not your granddaddy's point and click. You do point, you do still click, though now you also mash buttons because they added QuickTime events to, hide the fact that they don't have any gameplay. Although that's not fair. Dialogue is a sort of gameplay because you do have to manage or at least interact with other characters and try to keep them in line and try to defuse situations, so there is a gameplay in the dialogue alone. But everything else becomes superfluous. Sure, the combat was meant to be frantic and highlight the visceralness, if I can use that word without sounding like a douche, of splitting someone's head with an axe. And it worked. In the first game it worked. It did not work in the others. It especially did not work in The Wolf Among Us, where it's presumed you're playing as a superhero, a werewolf, and everybody else is sort of almost invulnerable, so there really is no point in having combat system altogether because there's no tension there. There's nothing there. But they had combat, so it would seem like there was more to the game. Sort of like Dreamfall also had a combat system which was horrible and pointless in the long run. It probably doesn't surprise you that the combat system in Dreamfall was imposed by the publisher and a kind of, adventure games being dead. That's why Dreamfall wasn't a point and click. It was a move controller and press the shoulder button to highlight what you can interact with. But I'm getting on a tangent again, so let's go back to the main idea. Adventure games changed. They became less about the joy of exploring a kooky, zany, crazy world or a depressing, horrible world and seeing its logic and interacting with it. It became more about the characters, more about the people, more about, I wouldn't even say story. Well, yeah, there is a story, absolutely there is a story, but it's a different kind of story. It's a story that is told at you instead of a story that is told through you. This may require a different show where I actually prepare for it and I can fully explain what I mean, but the main idea is that in older point-and-click games, you sort of felt like you had more agency, that your actions mattered more to the story, that you actually did something. Whereas in the Walking Dead and onwards kind of style of game, you're mostly going from cinematic to cinematic. Well, something like that. Again, I'll probably try and do a different show about it where I explain more about this. But thankfully, even though the mainstream of the adventure game is this now, it's cinematic, it's story driven, it's not really about playing the game, more about learning the story and the characters. And to be fair, I absolutely loved The Wolf Among Us and its story, its characters, though I deeply wished to be playing a CD Projekt Red game set in that world instead of a Telltale game. It's still a game that I enjoyed. But even though the mainstream is this now, the point and click, as we know it, is still around. Because you have people like the Dalek. The Dalek has made, I think, more adventure games than Telltale. Well, maybe not exactly more than Telltale, but still, they've made a lot of adventure games, and they are kind of really close to the original recipe of the genre. They have actual puzzles in them. They have stories that are told through your actions. Sure, they do have cinematics in them. They're modern games. They're not pixel-based antiquities like what Wajutai is making, which, again, those aren't bad games. Wajutai's Blackwell series is superb, but you kind of can see sort of a skimping on the puzzles there as well, especially in the later series, and an overuse of really laid out puzzles. And there are plenty of other developers, again more niche oriented, that still develop the kind of adventure game that better suits what we expected them to be back in the old days. They won't have success. They will have success, but they won't have the kind of success that Telltale has because they don't appeal anymore to a mass market. Though in some way, I think the market for this kind of adventure game never really changed, but the demographics shifted a bit where other genres acquired different kind of people and just had a larger base than adventure games ever had, than they could have. I know that's wrong, but it's something I like to believe, that adventure games haven't really faded away, that they've remained a constant, but it's the damn industry's fault for ignoring us, for ignoring the people that still want them. Yeah, that is sort of true. I mean, you won't see a AAA adventure game. You just won't. Like, the closest we had was honestly the Tomb Raider series. Tomb Raider was very well entrenched into the adventure game genre because you had a lot of puzzles. Up until Underworld. Sure, you had shooting, you had action, but you did have puzzles. The last boss of Underworld was a puzzle. It was a navigation puzzle that you had to solve. There was no combat in that last section. Compare this to the Tomb Raider reboot. I only played the first game of the Tomb Raider reboot, by the way, so I don't know if the Rise of the Tomb Raider fixed this. The reboot is just a poor action game with no substance to it and horrible characterization, and evidently made by someone with a fetish for seeing Lara Croft squeeze through things and then fall. I think that was someone's kink project or something. So in a way, I could actually say that the point and click is still around. Like, even in its new version, it's still around, where it's not so much based on puzzles. In its old version, it's still around because there are still a lot of games based on puzzles. But the action adventure sort of went more towards action. It sort of lost the adventure angle a lot. I should probably do a separate show about it when CES is not going on and actually have time to do it properly. So thanks for indulging this 15-minute rant about adventure games that went nowhere, and I'm curious to hear in the comments from you. What adventure game in the last 15 years did you enjoy? What more indie games, like less known games that maybe you think some other people don't know about? What adventure game that you believe deserves more time in the spotlight did you like? Grey Matter, for example, that's a game that honestly had superb puzzles and great point and click style gameplay. That's one of them. I honestly wish they made a sequel for it and not Mobius. Because Mobius was kind of... Mobius was the kind of scratch your head, you know, this was made by a Sierra employee kind of puzzles in it. Because there was one puzzle where you had to give someone some wine, and you could basically only buy that wine, any wine, in a certain city, in a game where you travel throughout the entire world, and it was kind of ridiculous. But what were your preferred adventure games during the drought, during the time when everybody said that the adventure game genre is dead, that point and clicks are gone, that there will be no more Monkey Islands, no more Sam & Maxes, no more Looms, no more Digs, no more Full Throttles, until they started remastering all of them. Goodbye.